Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It is great to be in Sydney, Australia. I think anytime there's a reason to fly down under is a good reason. I've been here a few times before. Believe it or not, one of the times that I did come here was to receive an award by Entrepreneurs Organization, and it was the Entrepreneur of the Year winner. I got a Thomas Edison original phonograph and was able to take that back to the States with me. I broke it upon getting back to the States, even though I managed to get there 8,000 miles. So that was exciting to be here for 24 hours then. Happy to be back again, to have a little more time this time and be in your presence. So crowdfunding itself, let me just start with a general question. How many of you have heard of crowdfunding? It's much different than earlier. How many of you have actually been on a crowdfunding platform? And how many of you have actually made a donation on one of those platforms? Okay, good. So it's good to see that a lot of you are familiar with it. It's great to see that some of you have experimented with it. It's good to see that many of you are here because you want to learn more about it. I and my peers think this is probably one of the most disruptive things to happen to the capital markets, the financial capital markets, since 1933 and 1934. Back then, the telephone had just come into existence. People were becoming very familiar with lifting up a phone and putting it to their ear and saying what's going on the other end there. Today, the laws that were crafted back then are essentially the same laws that we live under when it comes to raising capital in the markets. This process that we went through in terms of legalizing crowdfunding, and that's crowdfund investing, I should say, debt or equity-based crowdfunding, is one that was required because these laws have not been updated since 1933 and 34. There's a reason why they haven't. The private capital markets were working quite efficiently for us as entrepreneurs. As Andrew was saying, I had started a company by the name of FlavorX. We flavored medicines for children, so they're more compliant. I was able to go to the private capital markets 3 times and raise millions of dollars for this company. We sold that in 2007 and went out again, or I did, I should say, in 2010 and tried to raise more capital. I had an idea to use smartphones for instant polling. When I was at FlavorX, I had a board advisor ask me, what % of mothers have problems getting their kids to take medicine? And I said, well, it's about 90%. And he said, can you actually show me the data related to that? And so I said, I actually don't have that. And he goes, well, I suggest you go out and get it. So I hired a market research firm. I spent $50,000 in 3 months to find out, believe it or not, about 90% of mothers have problems getting their kids to take medicine. And I was irritated with the fact that I had to wait 3 months and spend $50,000 to get an answer that I already knew. Yet, everyone carries around these smartphones today. And I wanted to know, why hasn't someone come up with technology that allows me to send a text message out to a demographic of people that have opted in to take a survey? Mothers, for instance. And for me to say in this text message, the first 500 mothers to complete this survey in the next 5 minutes get $25. Statistically significant results I would get within 5 minutes, much less than $50,000, for which I could go back to the board, probably in that meeting right then and there, and say, here's the answer that you're looking for. Applications all over the place. So I competed in a startup weekend event. And so that's another question. How many of you are familiar with startup weekends? Good, good, I like this. We've got a little more entrepreneurial edge going on here. So these are events that are put on globally now. It's a 54-hour event. You go in on a Friday night, you pitch your idea to a group much like this, and they choose the top 15 ideas, and then you got 54 hours to build your proof of concept. And then in front of a panel of 5 judges, they choose the winner, and then they sort of set you free. And then you're stuck with the normal funding mechanism of going out there and trying to get capital for your idea. So I won that for this idea to use smartphones for instant polling. And I went out to the traditional means of financing my business. I went to my private equity people, I went to the bank, I went to my credit cards, and I realized that everything had seized up in 2010. The banks weren't lending anymore. As a matter of fact, actually, let me correct that. Banks were lending. You just needed to have 3 years of financials. So when I went there with my idea and they said we're lending, we just need 3 years of financials. I said, well, it's a startup. And they're like, that's okay, we just need 3 years of financials. So I learned early on that they're not saying no, they're just saying not to you. I live in Miami. Miami was one of the hardest areas hit in the collapse of the financial markets in the States. My home was underwater. The home equity that I used to fund my business in the past had disappeared, so that was out the door. Credit card options for financing is something that we commonly did. Interest rates jacked up, credit limits cut down, that wasn't an option. I went to my private equity folks and I said, guys, I got the next best idea. You funded me before, you saw what I could do, you saw, hey, I'm pretty qualified, I can get this done. Give me another shot. Yeah, we're actually not funding startups right now. We're sort of moving upstream. And what I realized is the whole capital flow had moved upstream. Investment banks, in many ways, had moved from the big deal opportunities, and the VCs looked at that as an opportunity to go in and finance bigger deals. The angels had moved into the VC place, and this funding void that exists for startups and small businesses got even bigger. So that $0 to $250,000 that startups and small businesses need to grow and prosper had disappeared. And I was frustrated. I didn't quite understand how you could use crowdfunding platforms to go out there and give money to people with really good ideas, mainly in the art-related industry, but there are people that are putting products up there that you can pre-order on Kickstarter. But nonetheless, you are giving money to someone or you're either pre-ordering a product. And it just didn't make sense to me that if we've got the technology today, why don't we have the ability to use those same dollars to help fund startups and small businesses, and instead of giving them the money, allow them, the investors, to actually own a piece of that pie? So it was that frustration that caused my friends to sit down and look at the securities laws in the United States and analyze them and realize, geez, these are the same laws we've been living under since 1933 and 34. But because of the collapse of the financial markets, we need to look at solutions. And this is what entrepreneurs do best. Where there's a problem, we look for solutions to those problems. So we crafted what we call the startup exemption, and we started lobbying Congress for it. And we were able to get tremendous traction very quickly because the timing was right. Our economy was struggling. We were out of jobs. They were looking for solutions. Everyone was complaining, nobody was showing up. We showed up with a solution, and we started walking the halls of Congress. Actually, when we first went to Washington, we went right to the SEC. And we said, under Section 3B of the securities laws, you have the right to carve out an opportunity for us to do a de minimis offering. It's another exemption, and it's in your purview. And they said, actually, we don't do anything like that anymore. You're going to have to go get an act of Congress. And so naively enough, we went over to Capitol Hill and started walking up and down the halls of Congress and asking people to get to support this idea that we had. People thought we were crazy. As with any ideas, you go through 3 phases. You go through, no, you cannot do this. These laws have been there for 80 years. Then you go through people that are saying, absolutely not. They're rejecting it, and they're fighting you on it. And that's where the regulators stepped in and said, we don't want you to do this at all. And then once it goes through, you get to the acceptance phase, where they're like, okay, this is law, this is going to happen, this can be good, we just need to have the structure in place to allow this to happen. And that's where we are right now. So I testified in front of Congress twice. The President and the White House did reach out, and we gave them a 2-page write-up about what we were talking about. They got on board very quickly. The House was Republican-controlled. So when they saw that the President was on board with this, they thought, well, this is a great opportunity for us to show bipartisan support, believe it or not. So this passed the House of Representatives 40717, 96% approval. It then went over to the Senate, where it was a little more controversial. However, it did pass as part of the Jobs Act 7326. When we went to the White House on April 5th, within 460 days, we went from bill to law. Just so you understand how incredibly challenging this is in the United States. There are over 10,000 bills that are introduced into Congress every year. Actually, not in every year, in the session that we introduced this bill. Of that, 220 became law. Of those 220, 7 were significant pieces of legislation, of which one of them was this. So the ability for us to go into Washington at a time where it's broken, clearly, I'm sure you hear as much as we do, that these people are not communicating with each other, they're not getting along, and they're not doing anything to help us. So for them to come together and realize that this is an opportunity to allow people to come together and solve solutions and fund them on their own is a good thing. So what I'm really excited about this is the change that it makes in the capital markets. And by that, I mean, before this, we'd had to go to the private capital markets, we had to go to the venture capital and look for that money. But now we've got the ability to do what we've been doing on the internet. We've seen this transformation take place on the internet. That started with Web 1.0, the internet. Then there was Web 2.0, where we're now using our social networks. So we've got LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter, and this is how we communicate with each other, and this is what we like, and this is what we comment on. And you know what? If we don't like what our government's doing, well, they topple them now thanks to Twitter. And this is the world that we live in. And everything is out there for everyone to see. So while back in 1993, we would joke around, if you don't want anyone to know who you are, go on the internet, it's very different today. Anything and everything that you say on the internet is a digital footprint for anyone to go back and find. And so there's more transparency that's built into the internet today. And so when we're looking at this disruption that's taking place on how you use the internet and technology to help fund startups and small businesses, it's only applicable now. It wasn't even applicable 5 years ago because of the transparency that we've seen with the internet. And so this transparency, this merging of seed and equity, seed and early stage financing, along with crowdfunding and that social network is what we call Web 3.0. And we think this is the next evolution of what's not only going to happen here in Australia or even in the United States, but globally. And by that, I mean, after this bill was passed into law, we got a phone call, and it was the World Bank. And they said, we think you're onto something. As you know, the developing world suffers from access to capital much more so than any of the developing nations. And it's been a challenge for us, particularly as we go out and we try and deploy capital, because we go in, we fund projects, and then 6 months after we pull out, the projects fail, 50% of them, because there's no engaged community on the other end. And we want to explore what you're doing with this engaged community and how you use the crowd to get people to buy in and stay in and become advocates for and have a potential return on this investment down the road. And so we've been working with the World Bank on this opportunity, and it's been fascinating for us to research trends that are going on globally. And by trends, I've learned a lot more about early stage financing than I ever even knew as an entrepreneur, even though I'm in the trenches working on my own ideas, trying to get capital for my ideas, working with my peers about it. So what I've learned are some really interesting facts. For one, VCs fund a ridiculously small percent of all the businesses out there, but they get all the press. VCs in the United States fund about 3,800 companies last year, okay? Now, that might sound like a lot, okay? And they do deploy about $30 billion of capital, but there are 27.5 million businesses that need capital in the United States, most of which are small. So we started to do a little more research. Well, how does that compare to the rest of the world? And the reality is, it's the same thing. The majority of businesses in the world are small businesses. And then when we started to work with governments like Mexico and Colombia in the World Bank in conjunction with all this research, we realized, these small businesses create the majority of the jobs that are out there. So when you start adding the figures together, you start realizing certain statistical important facts. Let's step back for a second. Capital markets. So if you look at the broad capital markets, about over 90%, I should say, of the capital that's in the markets is tailored for large corporations, which makes a lot of sense because they need a lot more capital than the small corporations. But it's a ridiculously small amount of capital in the capital markets altogether that is available for startups and small businesses. It's about 1%. So start putting all the little facts together that I was talking about. If you've got the majority of the businesses in the world that create the bulk of the jobs, but only have access to 1% of the capital out there globally, what could we do if we took 1% more of capital that's out there and deployed it to startups and small businesses? What could we do if we did 3% more? And that's the entire thought that's going into this. Not let's fund 100% of ideas that are out there, because you know what? I agree with you, and you're all saying it. Not 100% of those ideas out there are worthy of funding. But that's the benefit of crowdfunding, and that's where the wisdom of the crowd and what's coming down the pipe is so incredibly powerful. what you're going to see on these platforms that are coming up, and you've been on them, so you see how you put this pitch up there, people have to put their name, they've got to put everything about their idea, they put a video up there, there's a comment section where you can make comments about the entrepreneur, the idea, it's going to be, the business model is going to be picked apart too, the valuation, and you're going to have to put out there how much money you want to raise. Okay, so in our legislation, it's all or nothing financing. So that means you have to hit 100% of your funding target or no money's exchanged. So if I took that app idea that I had and said, you know what, I need to raise $250,000 for it, and I went out to my social network and I invited them all in, and I got $200,000 of commitments, that money sits in an escrow account. I can't touch it. So if I run out of time before I hit my $250,000 target, that money goes back to the investors and I lose out. But if it does hit the funding target and I do get my money, then I have reporting requirements, I've got income tax returns, I've got all the normal things that you need to do in a business. But the benefit of it is you now have an engaged community of people that have a vested interest in the success of that idea. And that transforms and that changes the way things happen in the private capital markets, particularly for startups and small businesses today. Because it's one thing for me to go out and have raised money for FlavorX from private capital individuals, and for them to be looking for a return, and everyone's looking for a return, but for them to be very focused on a financial return. Now we have the ability to go to a community of people and have them buy into the idea, have the potential for a return, but instead of them being passive investors, they are active brand evangelists. They are active marketing agents. They are actively out there talking about your product and service unlike anyone does before. I mean, I own stock in Apple. I have an iPhone. I don't go out there talking about Apple computer all the time or you should buy Apple stock. I don't. But I can tell you one thing. If I owned a piece of a coffee shop on the corner and I was going to have a meeting with someone, I'd be taking them to my coffee shop where I know that my return on investment is tied to me taking people to that coffee shop. And that's the transformation that's going to take place, is people that don't live in major metropolitan cities. Because not all great ideas reside in Sydney, in New York, in San Francisco. They are all over the globe. But people will now have the ability to have decent ideas that have the ability for a return, to put that out there and have people engage in that opportunity and then get a return on that. So there's two ways that this is going to happen. One of them is debt-based crowdfunding, and the other one is equity-based crowdfunding. So in one of my earlier talks, someone was talking about, well, what's the exit opportunity for someone in an equity-based crowdfunding endeavor? And what I was saying is the majority of opportunities that are out there will not qualify for equity-based crowdfunding. They're going to be small businesses that need $100,000 of capital to tide them over. Cash is king, and you can't survive without it. And so they're going to do a debt-based crowdfunding offering, most likely to their customers that are engaged in their business already, and they're going to loan them that money, the entrepreneur that money, so that they can get that $100,000. Think about it this way, because of that all or nothing financing mechanism that's put in there, if an entrepreneur says, I want to raise $100,000 of equity for my dry cleaner, and puts that pitch up on a crowdfunding platform, invariably, someone in the crowd is going to call them out on that opinion page, on that comment section, and say, what kind of exit strategy is there for a dry cleaner? And unless you win over the confidence of the crowd before that funding takes place, closes, you're not going to hit your funding target and that money's going to go back. So the wisdom of the crowd is going to come into play. People are going to have to think twice before they put their pitch up there and socialize their idea with the crowd. In the legislation that we've passed in the United States, there's a few things that are required. One, a background check. You have to go through a background check to make sure that you're not a bad actor before you get started in this. Provided that you pass that, then you have to fill out certain disclosures. You have to have a business plan, a use of proceeds, a valuation, and how you came to that. All of this is going to be up on these platforms for which people can review, comment, criticize, and you're going to have to defend as an entrepreneur. Again, if you don't win over the confidence of the crowd, you won't get funded. So that person that's thinking of doing an equity-based crowdfunding offering, when the crowd's thinking that's not the right way to go, won't hit their funding target. But for those ideas that do have the potential for a successful exit down the road, It gives people the opportunity to get in early on. And one of the things that we've realized is the majority of wealth that's created in these opportunities happens at the very early stages of formation for these companies. So now we're going to allow people to engage in these businesses, own a piece of pie, and actually have the potential for a return down the road. So what does this mean for the funding continuum? What does this mean for VCs or people that want to come in and fund these companies later on? Well, it means that we've just de-risked the entire investment for everyone. Because the entire capital markets, the private capital markets, are essentially private, they're incredibly opaque, and nobody knows what's going on in there. When I'm doing my round of financing for my small business, I sit in a boardroom, and I sit with investors, and I pitch them on my idea, and they pick it apart, and then we decide whether or not they're going to fund it or not, and then we all go our separate ways, and nobody knows what's going on in that room besides us. What this does is it opens it up so anyone can see what's going on and make a decision of whether or not they think it's worthy of funding. So the power of that comes back to what the follow-on capital will be looking for when they fund ideas later on. When you walk into VCs or private equity or angel offices, for that matter, with your idea, they say a couple things to entrepreneurs. They say, tell me about your idea, show me that business model, show me that you've gotten some revenue, show me that there's some customer traction to what you're doing. Because they want to know, are people going to buy this product or service? Is there really a market demand for it? These are the ways in which they're making their investment decision. Well, the beauty about crowdfunding is it allows you to test the waters. It allows you to put your pitch up there. It allows the crowd to say yes or no even before a dollar is funded. And if you get funded, it allows you to go back to those follow-on investors, the VCs, the angels, and say, you know what? I went to the crowd. I raised $150,000. I built my proof of concept. I've got an engaged community of people, and now I need more capital to get it done. And they're more likely than not going to fund that idea. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's crazy. Who's going to want 500 investors in a company? How are they going to be able to handle all that? Well, again, where there's problems, there are solutions. And the beauty about this entire industry that is evolving is the technology that is coming into play that will facilitate everything that's taking place down the road. And by that, I mean, once you get funded, you've got to keep in touch with your investors. Well, how is someone that's a small business entrepreneur going to keep in touch with all these investors? Well, you build tools and technology to enable that. So in the crowdfunding ecosystem that's developing right now, you've got companies, investor relation tool companies, that are building these products to enable entrepreneurs to take information and facilitate that communication to investors, to make sure that they're getting the right information that they need so that they're in compliance with the laws. So the ecosystem that's being developed is quite fascinating because it's going to allow transparency to develop in a very opaque market. It's going to train entrepreneurs to be better entrepreneurs. It's going to get the ones that are good and smart ideas the capital they need to grow, and it's going to give them access to further capital down the road. So that's what we're most excited about because we know that this solves a problem for people that don't qualify for traditional types of financing anymore. Now, I want to go back to what I was talking about earlier when I was saying 100% of ideas won't qualify. If you've been on the crowdfunding platforms, there's a couple things that happen. One, you're probably overwhelmed with everything that's out there, so ADD kicks in and you probably spend 2 minutes on there and you're out. So if you're thinking people are just going to spend all their time on these crowdfunding platforms trying to fund ideas left and right, I would like to see a little data that proves that, because I just don't believe that. The second thing, though, is you're going to see these people coming in and engaging in a way that allows them to fund just a small percent of the ideas that are out there. So if we can take, VCs are going to fund 3,800. They're going to fund a very small percent of them. But the whole thing is these people are looking at investments that hit their sweet spot. And not every investment hits a sweet spot that matches theirs. Crowdfunding allows the people that haven't hit that sweet spot to get in there and fund the other ideas. So if we can take 2 or 3% more and fund them, the impact that we can have globally will be tremendous. So I'll leave it at that. I'm sure you've got lots of questions. I look forward to answering them. And